Hello, you guys, and welcome to my weekly pick'ems. Obviously, we are now to week 10. We have 8 weeks left in the regular season, and up until this point, kind of crazy. I am just going to be making my picks off of the pick'em league I'm in. That's really, really big. And where obviously this year has not gone as expected, 76 to 57. But here we go. First game we have is tomorrow's game, Thursday night. Raiders visit Broncos in an AFC divisional matchup. The Broncos obviously coming off a close win to the Texans, where they weren't without their errors, but their defense played well enough despite people being like, oh, we're so worried about Surtain not being in. Obviously, looking at this game, I think about, the Raiders, they traded Myers. Myers obviously on the Seattle now, so they're without, some weapons. Obviously, they have Brock Bowers, whom I'm like, well, it should be enough to carry this team. Geno Smith has looked better as of late, but I just don't kind of see it with their team. And I think that, Myers, which kind of rounded out a decently young wide receiver core, being gone will affect them and Geno's ability. Obviously, it gives 6'5" Dante Thorne a chance to kind of rise up and do well. Overall, though, I think this is kind of a must-win for Denver against a struggling divisional opponent. I don't really expect Geno to be able to really have that much time against this Denver team that now has 40 sacks on the season through 9 games. That is averaging just over 4 a game, you guys. So pretty insane. And I'm going to go with Denver. Moving on, we have one of 2 of our last European games, the Falcons and the Colts. The Colts, as we all know, suffered a loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers obviously at home, but a game that, like, hey, this team just lost to the Packers, and then they really met up and they rallied together to say, hey, we really need to, toughen up. Do you actually play to our potential on defense so that our offense doesn't have to try and do the impossible with the lack of talent that they have and the lack of, I guess, high scoring ability they have, because they are a pound and run type team that has a quarterback that is very good at throwing. So Indianapolis, obviously a surprising loss. The Falcons missing an extra point and ultimately losing to the Patriots, which was my worry, because as we all know, the Falcons are super off and on, and they played a Patriots team that has been reeling and dealing with Drake May, and they played very, very well at the end of the game. Now, I think the Colts are really going to correct themselves, and they're going to show that overseas they can really have, the running game that they had up until, playing the Steelers last week. So I'm going to go with them, even though the Falcons still to this point have one of the top performing defenses in terms of yardage and that sort of thing. But I expect the Colts to win, especially with the new additions that they just brought in, like Sauce Gardner. And, we'll see how much better they look with the new additions. Moving on, we have the Bears hosting the Giants. The Bears have obviously won a plethora of games. Obviously, their last loss coming to the Ravens 2 games ago, but before that, they had won 4 in a row, and then they recovered against the Bengals. Or did they really recover? It's kind of interesting because, Jackson Dart plays with a lot of heart, and he plays with, without much help on his side of the ball, and even less since Scadaboo went out. The Bears, I would say, got more lucky than they did with ability last week. Obviously, they played a defense that really kind of showed to us how horrendous they are, where Caleb looked bad, against all other teams in quarters. And, besides the opening drive and besides the end of the game. So it's like, I'm not really still sold on Caleb. I think he does have to play like a top defense and do well. The Giants do pose an issue, but I am going to go with the Bears just because I think that they are pretty hot right now, and they're going to have a lot of confidence coming out of a win like last week, where they're like, well, we were able to settle down. We were able to kind of just, will ourselves to victory despite giving up a 14-point lead. I think, this could be a very close game, a very interesting game, but we're going to move on. Dolphins hosting the Bills. The Bills, the last time played the Dolphins, obviously it was in Buffalo. And Miami was kind of had a little bit of energy to them where they were like, we're not just going to go quietly. Now with how their team is and with how the Buffalo Bills have seemingly started to pick up and they come off a dominant win against Kansas City, I think the Bills can do what they should have done the first time, where they absolutely smother the Dolphins and show why they still have a lot to prove. So I'm going to go with the Bills. Looking at the Ravens visiting the Vikings in Minnesota, obviously the Vikings doing what probably nobody really thought is McCarthy returns and he shines and makes a few clutch throws against the Lions. I think that this shows the tenacity and ability of McCarthy to an extent to think that he always has a shot to win despite the opponent, which is always a good thing. And I think the Vikings getting Van Ginkel back was huge. I didn't think it would be enough to beat the Lions, but I thought it would help them. And he's clearly a difference maker on this team, which you need on defense. But the Ravens, obviously, they beat the Bears. Then they go on a bye week. And now it's kind of do or die, like Jackson said. The Ravens obviously need to kind of win this game, but the Vikings also really, really need to win this game as well. The fact of the matter is the Vikings looked a lot better, but the Ravens looked a lot better, but we haven't seen them in 2 weeks. So the Ravens being well rested, hopefully it's one of those things where you look at them and you're like, they're really going to, they're going to come out reeling, against the Vikings and play very, very good football. And overall, I just think that the Vikings, who haven't looked the best in terms of their secondary, and they did play an O-line that I'm still not exactly sold on, even though they played well against the Lions. Goodness, I totally lost my chain of thought. I think the Ravens have a pretty good O-line, and they're going to be able to keep Lamar Jackson clean. I also think that Lamar Jackson is going to be able to do some things that are going to make the Vikings second guess their pass rush, such as options to Henry and that sort of thing. And whatever they can do to kind of slow down this pass rush is going to make them tougher to beat. So I am actually going with the Ravens. You guys, I'm not just picking all of these teams that are the majority picked this week, but I think the Ravens are just going to be able to do things that are going to effectively slow down the Vikings defense. And I think the Vikings are going to play a much tougher defense unless we get the regular season defense of the Ravens this game. Then this game could quickly become a bloodbath. And Lamar Jackson obviously lost to the Lions in a kind of depressing game. And they're playing the whole NFC North. And then it's like they played the Bears. I think this team doesn't want to really lose to the whole NFC North. And I think the Vikings are another on their list that it's like, hey, we're going to beat these guys and we're going to show that we can hang with one of the toughest divisions. Moving on, though, we have Jets, Browns. The Jets obviously got rid of Quinnen Williams and Sauce Gardner. That defense doesn't look that great. However, I think the Cleveland Browns are just kind of a decrepit team. They have 69% picked here, but I am going to go with the Jets because I don't think much needs to be talked about, but I think that they have an offense that, with the new addition of Adonai Mitchell, hopefully he can stay healthy. They might prove to be a bit better than that. And I think that the Browns have struggled against these mobile QBs because they're not as easy to get after as some of these slower guys. And I'm kind of going with the Jets because they have put up a good amount of points this year against certain teams. And I think that overall, while this game is kind of a crapshoot, it's kind of the bottom dweller teams against bottom dweller teams. I just think to myself that the Jets, I think they're going to have a clear sort of gritted out mentality against this offense that hasn't really done that much. And they're still starting Dylan Gabriel, whom I just don't really believe in that much, if I'm being honest with you guys. So it's kind of a crapshoot of a game. The Jets 2.5-point underdogs. So, but overall, we'll see. One of these teams will have one. The Browns could get their first road win, and the Jets could get their first home win of the year. But who knows? That's kind of my upset pick of the week, if you can even call it that here. I'm picking the Jets. Moving on, we have Patriots and Buccaneers. A lot of people picking the Buccaneers here. They're obviously coming off a lot of rest. I believe Tampa is getting Bucky Irving back. Let me double check that real quick. So they both were not, Godwin and Bucky Irving weren't spotted at practice today, which is interesting. They list Bucky Irving as questionable with his injury, obviously. Chris Godwin, obviously questionable. Obviously, as we all know, Mike Evans is on IR. So you're looking at Johnson, Igbuka, Godwin, potentially, and then Bucky Irving and Rachaad White. Otherwise, this is a very healthy team, besides the injury to Cody Mock on their O-line. So looking at them, I think they've been kind of a quieter team to get the pass rush on certain teams. And you think about the New England Patriots, though, with their team, the way that they've looked is they've looked good defensively, very, very sound defensively, where, they kept the Falcons from scoring a lot early. Did somewhat have a collapse. I wouldn't say a collapse, but close to letting them tie and go into overtime. But you look at, Kayshon Boutte, thankfully didn't have a serious injury. He's questionable, though. So it's going to, it looks like it could be Diggs, Hollins, if Boutte really isn't able to go, and Demario Douglas. But overall, this team, I think, matches up very well to the Buccaneers in the sense that their D-line is just going to be able to smother the run and match up very, very well. I think this is going to be a kind of gritty game. Who's going to be able to really come out on top, though? And looking at this, I think that, if Christian Gonzalez doesn't play, that is bad, but it's going to be a really big test for Igbuka to play very, very well against Christian Gonzalez. Should he play his best football? Anybody playing against him, I think, has a tough time, as I think he's top 3. I think he's top 3 in the league in terms of, corners, in all honesty. So it's like, it's really a question of who to go with here. I think New England's been reeling, but I think Tampa Bay got the right people healthy, so I'm going to go with them in this game. Moving on, we have Saints and Panthers. The Panthers obviously beating my Packers last week. Ultimately, they're their defense that did let up a decent amount of yards, but not a lot of yards, had made the most of it of opportunities. Obviously, one dropped interception, but it was on a 4th and 8. But overall, I think that you look at the Panthers and they're a run the football kind of team with Rico Dowdle, obviously, and then their O-line seemingly has all bought in to Rico Dowdle, who I think makes it a little bit easier on their banged up O-line to operate because pass protection isn't the focal point of this offense. Now the Saints, they traded Rashid Shaheed, so they have less weapons. Shuck didn't look terrible last week. We'll obviously see, whether his longevity carries through to this game. But the Panthers, who play a stifling and gritty defense, I think that is, people really don't really give them credit just because their name is the Carolina Panthers. And they've been bad for years. And they were above 500, a couple of games ago, obviously getting back above 500 with a win over my Packers and that sort of thing. But I'm going to pick Carolina just because I think that the Saints don't really have the defense to me to stop Carolina, and I think that overall the Panthers are coming off a strong win and they're looking to carry that over to a home game. Now looking at a divisional matchup of the AFC South, we have the Texans and the Jaguars. CJ Stroud has already been ruled out, which is unfortunate. The Jacksonville Jaguars, obviously a team that they barely beat the Raiders. The Texans are favored by 1.5 this game, so they're essentially saying Jacksonville, you get a certain number of points going towards the home team. They're saying Jacksonville's the better team, but giving the Texans the home field advantage. So looking at this, obviously with CJ Stroud being out, you look at Davis Mills being out, the QB. He didn't play terribly at the end of their last game. But you look at Jacksonville, and Jacksonville, to me, they, Travis Hunter being hurt is obviously a bad thing. But they didn't trade Brian Thomas, who obviously has been dealing with an injury. They get Jacoby Myers, who I think will be a very, very good addition for them. Will actually give them somewhat of a deep threat. And, Parker Washington hasn't been terrible. And I think that, Bashal Tuden should honestly get more carries. I think he's just been a pretty good player when he's gotten opportunities this year. And obviously the defense is very, very for the most part, very healthy for the Jaguars. And I think that because of that, I'm going to give this game to the Jaguars, even though the Texans have looked like a pretty good defense. I just think the Jaguars have a little bit more going for them. And I think that they're going to be able to get after Mills. And I think with his limited ability, it's just going to be tough. Moving on, we have the Cardinals and the Seahawks. Obviously, the Seahawks dominate the Commanders. I personally, here's my take on it. I think the Seahawks are hitting the stride, obviously, and have been hitting the stride this year. They've had a couple of unlucky losses. Week 1 against the Niners that they should have honestly won. And then now I can't even remember, I guess, their other one type of thing. But they've been, a little inconsistent, I guess, in the run game. But looking at the Cardinals, obviously Harrison had a game. Jacoby Brissett clearly looks better, and they put Kyler Murray on IR. So Brissett is going to be starting. He's clearly looked better than Murray. The Seahawks, I just don't see letting up. And I think obviously that they're also getting healthier, towards the, this part of the year. Obviously you miss your safety, but Emin Warry's been playing super, super well and has proved why he might be the best. He's been the best second round pick so far and worth trading up for like the Seahawks did. But I'm going with the Seahawks. I think the Cardinals can put up a feisty game just because it is a divisional matchup. And if they were to win a game here, it would be huge for them. Because obviously dropping down to 6 wins with 7 7 games left, or 8, or excuse me, dropping down to 6 losses and then having only 11 games left out of the year, it's just, you're entering that territory, especially in this division, where you're just not going to be able to do anything, and you're really looking to next year. The Rams and San Fran, I just don't think it has what it takes. I think that the Rams are also hitting their stride. They need to keep pace with the Seahawks, in order to have a shot at winning the division. They obviously play again, being in the same division, and this is kind of this could be an interesting week, and we think that the Seattle Seahawks and the Rams are just automatically going to win against the 2 lesser teams in the division, despite the Niners winning a lot more games with their banged up team than, I would have thought was possible. They obviously have a weaker schedule, but the Rams, I think, are just like, we really shouldn't have lost our games. We could be the sole proprietor to the number 1 record in the NFC at this point, but also, I guess, being tied with the Seahawks and the Eagles, who obviously play the Packers on Monday night. This could be a huge, huge game. Moving on, we have Commanders in Detroit. This game I don't think needs much talking about. Obviously, Jaden Daniels suffered that dislocated elbow, which was, I hated looking at that. I don't think there's really any shot that Marcus Mariota somehow pulls an upset. I don't care if Scary Terry's coming back. I do not care. The 3% that picked the Commanders, here's the thing that I say about the Commanders, and here's the other thing. This is a revenge game for Detroit. This to me is somewhat reminiscent of when, maybe not quite as much, but when last year we had the Lions go to play the Cowboys, who had taken a game from them, and BS calls and everything, and the Detroit Lions went and they just ran up the score against them. Now, I don't think they're really a team for sentiment towards any other team. I think they try to play their best football. I think they try to play their scheme. I think they try to, poke fun. I think they try to poke fun at the other team as much as they can, regardless of who the opponent is. I think Detroit is going to go, and they are ultimately going to destroy the Commanders. And Commanders fans are really going to realize that there is nothing going this season. Now we have Sunday Night Football. We have Steelers going to go visit the Chargers. Across the country trip. The Chargers obviously winning last week and the week prior, where they pummeled the Vikings. The Steelers obviously beating the Colts and then losing to the Packers the week prior. They go on the road, obviously, after 2 games at home. The Steelers, to me, if they play the way they did last week against the Colts, I think that they can beat the Chargers. But the Chargers have had a defense that has clearly been up and down. This is actually a game where I'm like, why do I feel like Pittsburgh, when they were under the bright lights 2 Sunday nights ago, which is crazy that they, I guess, have, 2 time games and 3 games, just didn't perform up to standards. Obviously, the Chargers as well do not have Joe Alt. Joe Alt is... unfortunately, he is out. I'm pretty sure. Let me double check it real quick. But if he is out, I just expect... And that's right, he's out. He's not even listed on their depth chart anymore. So what do I say about that? I think that without your tackles, even though, TJ Watt only lines up in one spot, I think the Steelers are actually going to get the better of the Chargers. And this is really going to help them when it comes time for playoffs, because if they're able to, obviously right now it wouldn't matter because the Steelers are atop of their division and they can stay that way. But the Chargers, obviously they'll know a lot more, with where they stand in terms of what happens with Broncos and Raiders, but tomorrow night on Thursday. But I just don't see them being able to protect Herbert well enough to, do really well. And the Pittsburgh Steelers will be a team that'll run the football a lot, and I think they can kind of expose the Chargers, who haven't had the best run defense. Now we move on to Monday night. Obviously a huge, huge game. You think of the Packers and losing to the Panthers, and then you think of the Eagles obviously having a bye, and most of the teams they needed to lost last week. Lions and Packers, obviously. I think of the Eagles going to Lambeau and having seen the Packers, they didn't give up a crazy amount of yards to Rico Dowdle, but you think about how they really didn't get that many tackle for losses, like 3 tackle for losses and that sort of thing. I just think that this game, and the Packers have kind of played their best ball under, primetime games. First game of the season, obviously against the Lions, wasn't primetime, but it was a 2:00 game. Then Washington, primetime game against the Steelers, primetime game. Another win of that's I'm trying to remember. The Cardinals obviously wasn't a primetime game, I guess. But overall, the Packers have played, and I mean, I guess a tie against the Cowboys, but they light it up. They put up 40 that game. So thinking of Philadelphia, obviously they made some moves. They acquired the linebacker. Goodness, why can't I remember his name? From the Dolphins. So what was his name? Jalen Phillips. Kind of wild to me that they get Jalen Phillips and they move him ahead of Jihad Campbell, who I thought had been playing like pretty all right football. Obviously Zach Bond and Nakobe Dean on that linebacker core as well. And then you can't forget about Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis on the D line. I think that looking at their corners, Adoree Jackson hasn't looked the best on their team. Obviously, he's kind of the third guy. Quinyon Mitchell's been good. I don't think as impressive as year one, but still very, very good. Don't get me wrong. It's not like he's that much worse. Becomes a little bit easier when you have film on guys and they're in the same system in year two. Cooper DeJean, obviously a stud, willing to go and tackle just about anybody. A very strong tackler. And then you think about them acquiring Jair Alexander. It's kind of interesting because you make it think that, maybe he's going to feed them information on Love. I feel like most people kind of know what they're getting with Love. But it's, he does, regardless, the wind gusts to me are kind of what, gave one of the interceptions, up where it looked like a really bad football. But you look at, how far that ball flew in the air, how high it went. And then you look at Bryce Young's, which didn't go to trajectory either in the end zone where McKinney picked it. I just think that the Packers are going to be kind of a bat out of hell. And this is also a revenge game. Last year, the Packers, this might sound crazier, like, oh, I'm kind of projecting that my Packers can beat any good team, which I think they can roll with anybody this year on any given Sunday. But the Packers have really kind of handled these teams that have winning records or are projected or had winning records last year. And last year, the whole narrative was they can't be good teams. And this year, beating most of the good teams and then, tying or losing to, the sub 500 teams, I guess, if you look at them at this point in the season. But, in any sense, I think that my Packers are going to come out. They're going to do Lambeau a service. And I'd also like to take this moment that I think that when a guy like Kraft, who is so moving for an offense, I think that it can really rally a team. And I think the Packers, with the plethora of talent that we have on the team, I think it's something to be said that I think that they're going to rally and they're going to really kind of prove that they still belong and that this is kind of a test game. So I'm actually picking the Packers. And I also don't trust the Eagles, who obviously they've had a bye week to kind of stew on their issues and whatever else. So perhaps, maybe they're going to lay it to rest and now go on a run at the end of the year. I could kind of see it. But overall, I think my Packers are eager to get at it and eager to kind of prove themselves to the Eagles, a team they lost to twice last year, much like the rest of the division, the division, obviously. And only winning one game against the Bears within the division. So you look at the Eagles, and it's just this rivalry has formed, and you can't tell me that the Packers aren't chomping at the bit to get back at it. I guess I didn't look at the money line, but the Packers were listed as favorites in this game, surprisingly enough. And let me see. They're still 2.5-point favorites. So it's interesting to me that a lot of people, I guess, are seemingly going for the Eagles, who Saquon Barkley is, somewhat questionable with an injury. I just think that their run game hasn't been as good. The Packers, played them pretty well last year despite that sort of thing. But I think this could be a really fun game, and I hope the Disney lockout, ends, I guess. So tell me what you guys think about these games. I know that a lot of these, I didn't really pick. I picked a lot with the grain, I guess, this week, only picking the Steelers. I guess, the Jacksonville and Houston is somewhat of a toss-up. Tampa Bay, I think, I don't think it should be this much. I think that New England's been playing pretty good football. Obviously the Jets, but this is kind of a crapshoot of a game in my eyes. But overall, I think pretty interesting week of games. And it should be really fun looking onward. But I want to thank you guys all for watching. And as always, go Pack Go.